This video was sponsored by Squarespace. Training your muscle will only get you so far. If you want to tap into your true potential, then you need to focus on what actually controls that muscle, the central nervous system. All of us have a vague idea that the central nervous system is important for strength and performance, but how many of you actually know what it is, how it works, and how to target it in your training to make it more efficient? Keep watching and find out why all training is brain training. Simply put, your central nervous system refers to your brain and your spinal cord. As well as being responsible for our thoughts, our memories, and our personality, this is also where signals to move the body originate, and they are then fed to the peripheral nervous system, allowing for conscious control over our body. Your muscles are made up of thousands of muscle fibers, tiny muscle cells that can extend and compress together in order to lengthen and shorten the muscle, and move the corresponding joints. They can do this because they're made up of tiny myofilaments. These in turn are comprised by actin and myosin. You don't need to know the details, but these proteins essentially slide across each other, allowing the muscle cell itself to shorten as needed. When enough muscle cells shorten, the muscle contracts. Note that individual muscle fibers are binary. They either contract or they do not contract. They can't contract slowly, and nor can they contract halfway. To give you a rough idea, the bicep contains somewhere between 200,000 to 500,000 muscle fibers. But in order to contract those muscle fibers, you first need to send a signal from the brain, your intention to do so. Inside the brain, therefore, is a region known as the primary motor cortex. This contains a map of the body known as the motor homunculus, where each neuron corresponds to areas of the body you may wish to control. An electrical impulse known as an action potential, it results in movement in the corresponding part of the body. Note that each action potential only lasts for around 10 to 100 milliseconds, depending on the muscle in question. So in order to sustain a longer contraction, that actually requires the continuous firing of multiple motor neurons, rather than just one for a long time. When you decide to bend your arm, a signal begins life at the corresponding part of the motor cortex, and then makes its way down the spinal cord to the neuromuscular junction to act upon, or innervate, the muscle in question. But here's the key thing to understand about all of this. The signal does not cause the entire bicep to move, and nor do signals act upon the hundreds of thousands of muscle fibers individually. Instead, they act upon the motor units being groups of muscle fibers within a muscle that are all innervated by a single corresponding motor neuron. These aren't discrete little bundles of fibers like you might imagine, but rather interwoven and scattered throughout the muscle, seemingly at random. However, the motor units are organized into smaller and larger groups of muscle fibers, to get big ones and small ones. Likewise, some consist of the powerful type 2A and type 2X muscle fibers, whereas others are comprised of the slower but more efficient type 1 fibers. Motor units do not mix their fiber types. As you may expect, the number of motor units in any given muscle varies greatly depending on the muscle in question and genetic variability. However, the average bicep will contain somewhere between 300 to 800 motor units, these being the smallest contractile units of the muscle. The strength of the signal sent from the brain will determine how many motor units are recruited at once. Weaker signals will recruit only a few of these smaller motor units, as these have a lower activation threshold. But as the neural drive or effort increases and the signal becomes louder, this will also be enough to activate the larger and more powerful motor units. This means that motor units are always recruited from the smallest and weakest first, with the stronger and larger units being added as needed. This is Henneman's size principle. I talk about it all the time on this channel. As I was editing this one, I realised that I should probably mention the distinction between the upper motor neurons and the lower motor neurons. So the upper motor neurons are located in the motor cortex, and the lower motor neurons are located in the spine. But it's the upper motor neurons that control the lower motor neurons, so this doesn't really change anything. Just thought it'd be useful for you guys to know as we're trying to make this a complete description of the central nervous system. It's the upper motor neurons that are organised in that homunculus kind of shape. And just to explain that a bit more, this isn't a brain area, it's just the way that the motor neurons are organised, which kind of looks like this sort of misshapen man, because you have more motor neurons representing parts of the body that you have more control over, and fewer where you have less control. Useful to know this is distinct from the sensory motor homunculus, which represents your proprioception and your feeling. They look kind of similar because you tend to have more sensation in areas you can control more, but they're not exactly the same. Seeing as action potentials are binary, you might now be wondering how the volume of a signal can increase. The answer is rate coding. That is to say that more rapid signals are able to cumulatively stimulate the motor neurons to fire. As effort increases, so does the rate coding. Where things get really interesting is in noting that nobody can recruit 100% of the motor units available to them at once. Untrained athletes in particular can recruit somewhere from 30% to 75% of their motor units maximum, depending on the muscle in question and again, individual differences. Trained athletes, however, can recruit anything from 80 to 95% of the motor units. Take these figures with a grain of salt, however, as you'll see them vary depending on the study. But as you can see, adaptations within the nervous system are what will lead to massive increases in strength. Before training, you literally have huge motor units capable of amazing strength within your muscles that you can't access. This goes a long way to describing noob gains, but it could also mean that you're missing out on a lot of potential strength even after you've grown your muscles to be bigger in size. Fascinatingly, we know that cellists, for example, have physically larger areas in their primary motor cortices responding to their fingers. Brain plasticity, the ability of the brain to change shape to adapt to the requirements placed on it, ensures that these often used areas actually grow and thicken. The same is very likely true for athletes. As you learn to control more of the muscle, this would theoretically lead to an increase in grey matter and cortical thickness in that part of the brain, making your little motor homunculus even more misshapen and even more buff. Think of this, I can wiggle my ears because I learned the muscle control necessary to do so. Almost everyone can do this because they have the necessary muscles, but it's through training and a misspent youth that I was able to gain control over those muscles. The same thing happens over specific motor units throughout your skeletal muscle. You can move your bicep, but you can only move part of it, and thickening the muscle fibre through hypertrophy training won't change that. We call this process intramuscular coordination. There's another side to all of this too, motor patterns and skill acquisition. Learning new skills does not result in changes to the muscle. All of this resides in the brain, and specifically the motor cortex once again. As you repeat movements over and over, you create connections between different parts of the motor map. Neurons that fire together, wire together, literally reaching out and forming new connections to allow signals to cross from one to the other. Thus, new neural maps are created, corresponding to particular movement patterns and reaching from the primary motor cortex to the premotor cortex, which helps to plan and prepare movement. The supplementary motor cortex, which helps to initiate movement sequences and coordinates the two sides of the body, the basal ganglia, which assists with voluntary movement, and the cerebellum, which fine-tunes motor actions. The more you rehearse these movements, the more efficient the pathways become. Repeated firing actually insulates the pathways, causing long-term potentiation, meaning that one neuron in a sequence more readily innervates the next. Pruning also occurs, removing unwanted connections. Take an untrained athlete and ask them to throw a punch and you'll see a pattern in their brain that's kind of fuzzy with the signal leaking out into other neighbouring regions. Accordingly, their whole body will be somewhat tense. They might hold their breath. They might be contracting their bicep, actually slowing down the movement. Their shoulders will be up and tense. I'm describing myself here, by the way. Even if they know what to do consciously, it'll be very hard not to make these mistakes, because a strong enough signal to throw a punch will light up unwanted areas of the motor cortex. In a trained athlete, however, the signal will be much more precise and refined. A trained martial artist can throw a powerful punch while keeping the rest of the body entirely relaxed, breathing completely normally all the while. The sequence may also be wrong in the untrained individual. Perhaps the hip turns too late in the movement, or the body doesn't turn enough. They have to actively concentrate to get this part right on all those things at once, whereas it's so ingrained for the professional as to be like riding a bike, literally because the movement pattern is learned in just the same way that riding a bike is. Crucially though, it's also possible to include external stimuli in these movement patterns, which helps us to develop reflexive movement patterns. So for example, if someone kicks me low, I tend to use a lower block to stop it without thought, thanks to years of karate. When you ride a bike, you take into account feedback from your proprioception and equilibrioception, constantly adjusting position to remain balanced on the bike even as you nearly fall. When you drive, you likely stop at a red light without needing to consciously remember to do so. These neural pathways are so strong and so ingrained in us that in some cases of traumatic brain injury, individuals who have completely lost their memories are still able to play the piano flawlessly. The premotor cortex plays a particular role in movements guided by external cues. We call this kind of coordination intermuscular coordination. Okay, so that's how the central nervous system works, and why it's so important for developing strength and coordination. But how do you go about training it? Well, if you want to improve your intramuscular coordination, your ability to contract more of a single muscle, then you need to practice sending a stronger and stronger neural drive, a stronger and stronger signal with effort. This means you need to lift heavy and/or explosively. That's 80% of your 1 rep max and above, although some studies suggest that this needs to go as high as 95%. When you lift lighter weights for high rep ranges like a bodybuilder, you simply aren't sending the strongest signal possible unless you also move highly explosively. This is one reason that bodybuilders who lift for higher rep ranges will not develop quite as much strength as powerlifters. They simply don't practice it. Bodybuilding isn't useless. Other very beneficial adaptations occur, such as developing strength endurance and increasing the mind-muscle connection, sometimes between lesser used muscles. You want to contract your obliques or whatever. There's another way to train this max output power as well though, and viewers of this channel already know the answer: overcoming isometrics. That means pushing or pulling against an immovable object, trying to push down a wall or pull apart a thick piece of rope, bend a piece of iron. This works so well because it lets you practice sending the maximum signal from motor unit recruitment. Thus, you get better at sending that stronger signal thanks to, once again, brain plasticity. Unlike lifting a 1 rep max, this also allows you to send that maximum signal for longer. The strength curve means that only a small portion of a maximum lift actually involves maximum strength. Momentum plays a role. And it allows you to do all that without creating as much muscle damage, and therefore without incurring such a high recovery demand. Basically, you can do it more often. I've made videos on this in the past, so I won't go into it in a lot of depth here, but this is one way to train your nervous system specifically. I'd also recommend the channel No Limit Squad for a far more detailed instruction on using overcoming isometrics. Overcoming isometrics can also be useful in other ways. For example, it actually encourages reciprocal inhibition, meaning it can teach you to relax the antagonist muscles, increasing movement efficiency, power output, and mobility. And again, this is due to changes in the central nervous system. As for training the movement patterns, the key is simply to remember that strength is also a skill, and skills are learned through repetition. The goal here then is to practice movements repetitively, but without, once again, incurring unnecessary fatigue. This is where greasing the groove comes in very useful. If you want to learn to perform handstands perfectly, for example, you need to put in the reps and the time, just like playing the piano. And greasing the groove would mean practicing a handstand every single day. And because handstands are more about skill than strength, if you train them in that way, doing just a couple of reps at a time, then you can actually get away with doing this. Spacing the sessions out throughout the day like this also has other advantages. Specifically, it allows you to repeatedly activate the neural pathways while also giving them time to reset in between repetitions. This is referred to as spaced learning, and it's more often used to refer to things like revising for a test, but the same also does apply here. To the extent that, if your workout includes a skill like a handstand, it might make sense to practice it 3 times throughout the workout or your routine, the beginning, middle and end, rather than all at once. The same can also go for practicing perfect squat technique, using a lighter weight than you would do during training. Because you're reinforcing those movement patterns, you're going to make the movement stronger and more efficient, so that when you do add the weight back on at the gym, you'll therefore be better at moving it. Repeating the same movement perfectly over and over will help you to refine your technique more and more, and this becomes increasingly important for skills-based movements like calisthenics, parkour, gymnastics or martial arts. But even if you're not interested in those things, I recommend that everybody try and learn some more advanced skills like this, simply because the body control and awareness that it will give you through the central nervous system will bleed into everything else you do. You'll move more without holding your breath, you'll be able to control your scapula and your pelvis, and so much more. But there are 2 more elements to consider as well. One is that you don't want to only rehearse perfect movements. You also need to add variation and unexpected elements. That might mean doing handstands on uneven surfaces, for example. And the reason for this is that it alters the inputs and it gives you more practice at adjusting the precise movement patterns. As Nikolai Bernstein says, it builds more robust movement patterns. This is another concept I like to discuss ad nauseum, but that's because it's so important to remember and it's so often overlooked. I recently discussed this on a podcast with Gregory, who has an excellent kettlebell channel that I recommend, Leberstark. I recommend checking out the full video, but here's a clip that summarizes what I'm talking about. Nikolai Bernstein, neurophysiologist, describes it as creating more robust movement patterns. So like instead of there being just one area, one direct line where you're really strong, you've got like a little bit of wiggle room because you're used to moving in slightly more dynamic ways. And in the book, The Brain That Changes Itself, there's a really good analogy, which is like when you're rehearsing a movement, it's like going down a ski slope. And if you take the exact same route every time, then you create this really deep groove in the slope, which means you're amazing at going down following that groove, but you're not going to be able to go anywhere else because that's all still thick snow. But whereas if you take a slightly different path every time, you're creating a wide flat surface. Like he wasn't talking about it in fitness, but it applies so well. And now you can make a slight mistake without being at serious injury because you've got those more robust movement patterns. And then that's exactly what you're doing with something like kettlebell. So one of the things that's so cool about it is that it is slightly different every time. You are at those awkward angles, but if you're learning using a lighter weight to begin with, you're building up the motor patterns, you're building up the tendons, the fascia, the supporting muscles, so that you can deal with the slightly unexpected. Like when my kid runs at me and leaps into me when I'm squatting on the floor and I'm not expecting it, like she has no regard for my health or safety. But I can usually cope with it because And it's also important to remember to include the inputs in your practice. If you want to get good at hitting a ball, you need to practice hitting a ball, not just swinging the bat. Finally, I want to briefly touch on recovery and the concept of frying your central nervous system. This is a big issue for athletes who are worried that overtraining will burn out their nervous system, leading to a complete loss of strength or just massively decreased performance. And this is something that powerlifters typically see, in particular if they try and increase the weight on their max lifts over a sustained period. Unless they want to see a plateau or regression in strength, they need to actively recover as part of their workout. But it's important to consider the context here. This actually has very little to do with the central nervous system. New research shows that while you can fatigue the nervous system, it's actually an acute effect, and it recovers within a few hours maximum. This is not a chronic issue. We know this from measuring the strength of the signal at the neuromuscular junction. After 30 minutes to a few hours, it's back to normal, so the signal is just as strong. So why does overtraining make you feel weaker? Why do you feel like your nervous system is spent? Well, chances are that it's a lot more akin to what we think of generally as burnout. Chances are that it has more to do with your autonomic nervous system rather than your central nervous system. Your fight or flight response and your recovery. That is to say that over time, placing too much demand on your nervous system means being in a heightened state of stress for long periods. A high allostatic load. That can in turn have a cumulatively negative effect for performance and general health. Essentially, chronic stress isn't good for you. Who'd have thought? But this can then lead to dysregulation of the HPA axis, neurotransmitter depletion potentially, insomnia, loss of motivation, and the accumulation of issues such as injuries and even low-level infections. The truth is, it doesn't really matter what the precise mechanism is here. What matters is that you give yourself a break and don't push yourself continuously. And the autonomic nervous system and the central nervous system are linked. We know that chemicals like adrenaline make us stronger, allow us to tap into greater recruitment of muscle fiber. So if you're completely spent and burned out, then you're not going to be able to recruit as much strength. If you're very tired, you're not going to feel as strong. It's very simple, really. Adrenal fatigue is not actually a scientifically accepted term at the moment, but something like this is happening. You're exhausted from being stressed all the time, and you're not as strong as a result. It's not rocket science. Can you train yourself to improve resilience to long-term stress and high-level exertion? Well, many believe it's possible, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest it is. This is one objective of military training, and it's also seen in the likes of the Bulgarian method. Here, athletes use their maximum lifts daily and reportedly go through a period of immense distress that they refer to as the dark times, before emerging the other side, often with immense displays of strength. I recommend watching Alexander Bromley's video on CNS fatigue, as it's very interesting, and he talks about that. One more addendum, it's interesting that the studies also actually show that it's endurance training that causes more central nervous system fatigue. So that is to say that heavy lifting isn't quite as fatiguing for the central nervous system, as we thought. That said, it's important to think about people's lived experience here. We know that you can become very fatigued from doing heavy lifting, so it's always something to bear in mind. But really, the chronic fatigue that we associate with CNS fatigue has more to do with kind of like the sort of tiredness you might experience after a very busy period of work than it does with any kind of neurological change affecting muscle contractions. But in the short term, CNS fatigue might actually be the problem. If you find that the fog is descending in the latter rounds of a fight, for example, that might be because your CNS truly is fried. The good news is that there's evidence that you can improve this capacity with training too. As I've described before, JC Santana trains his athletes to improve their psychomotor vigilance. To do this, he trains them to the point of fatigue and then has them perform tasks that require focus, things like dodging pool noodles. Chess boxing might offer similar benefits, and again we see similar stress inoculation training used by certain military groups. Whether this kind of training results in more efficient synapses, increased neurotransmitter receptor sites, or some alternative adaptation, again it doesn't really matter, the result is the same. We can improve focus and attention under stress and fatigue through training. So is this going to drastically change your approach to training? Well, this time it might actually have a big impact. I hope if nothing else it shows that brute force approaches to training aren't always the most effective. Sometimes a little more finesse can have a superior result. It also should show that it's not all about strength. You can move with power and grace and develop the reflexes of a ninja in a manner completely divorced from strength training. I hope it's encouraged you to just practice your movements and maybe to incorporate overcoming isometrics. When it does come to strength, remember, strength is a skill. Treat it as such and you can tap into some huge reserves of power and performance. So I hope you found this video useful and interesting, guys. If you did, then please leave a like and share it around. If you like this kind of training that goes beyond just, lifting dumbbells to grow bigger biceps and instead focuses on every aspect of human performance, from strength to endurance to focus, then you might like my ebook and training program, Super Functional Training 2.0. I'll leave a link in the description down below. There's a slight discount on over summer, but either way, I really appreciate you guys watching, and I'll catch you next time. Bye for now! Hello again. This video was sponsored by Squarespace. So Squarespace, as you probably know by now, is a website building platform. It makes it as easy as possible for anyone to build a website, literally in minutes with no coding knowledge necessary, and then you can expand it as far as you want thanks to a huge selection of features. You'll build your site by selecting a template, one of many ready-made ones. That's the easiest way to get started, and then you can customize it to your heart's content simply by dragging and dropping elements wherever you like. You'll have your site up and running in minutes, and then from there you can start adding features, and they have such a wide range of features. Some of the highlights include search engine optimization tools. That means you can optimize your site for appearing higher in the search results on Google and other search engines, basically meaning it's easier for other people to find your website, bringing more traffic in, more eyes on your content, and potentially more customers if you're running a business. You have comprehensive e-commerce tools, and if you sell a service, there's even appointment scheduling, so you can book appointments with your clients. The list goes on and on. Honestly, there's everything you possibly need. That's why many big brands use Squarespace to run their websites. If you want to find out more, then head over to squarespace.com, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Bioneer to get 10% off your first domain or website. Thanks again to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Thanks to you guys for watching, and once again, bye for now.